Hey everybody, let's try this again, shall we? So styling React for reuse. As opposed to going through the standard CSS and JS library thing that has been really popular this season, I decided to try a little different approach to this. But before I do that, I'm going to show you a lovely picture of me that I took in my living room. I am Jen Luker. I am a team lead software engineer at Deseret Digital Media. I work on the KSL Classifieds website, mostly the cars vertical. And I am reachable at Twitter mostly, GitHub, the standard resources. So, we learn from failure much more from success. We often discover that what we will do by finding out what we will not do, and probably he who never made a mistake never made a discovery. If you have a code base, you've made mistakes. If you don't have a code base, this is probably not the talk you're looking for. So most of the time what we're looking for is how can we make our code bases better? How can we iterate in order to improve what we have? And how can we make our components reusable? Because oftentimes you're going to want to reuse them. You reuse buttons over again, you reuse tabs over again. What do you need to do in order to make those reusable? I'm going to go over 3 major points today. The first one is accessibility. And I want to propose that unless your components are accessible, they are not reusable. Primarily because we don't want to be perpetrating the same mistakes over and over again by making sure that the people that we want to be able to use our components can't. So, show of hands or clapping or however you feel to express yourselves, how many of you have had a repetitive stress injury, like tennis elbow or carpal tunnel? A few hands. How about any of you have had your eyes dilated? Have you tried to type while holding a baby? Or a cat? Or a dog? How many have watched a video in a loud room? Have you watched a film in a language you didn't know? Yeah? How many of you have had your mouse batteries die and you're just too lazy to change them? And how many of you or your children had a computer read you the text because you're too young or too inexperienced to understand what the words say? Dead silence. Everyone was born knowing how to read. All right. How many of you have interacted with your phone, watched TV, or otherwise interacted with technology while you were under the influence of any of these experiences? Right? Okay. So I want to propose, again, what if there weren't subtitles? There was no zooming. There were no large buttons. Color contrast was very thin. Keyboard shortcuts didn't exist. Could you still have interacted with this technology? Nope. Probably not. So as Jennifer Van very lovely said in her React Rally talk, I would say 90% of your day is dictated by technology. And if you as a person are not included in that technology, what's the point if the app is fast? If you can't use it, the rest of it just doesn't matter. And oftentimes when we think about accessibility, we're thinking about people who are permanently disabled. But there are a lot of people in this room who have had temporary disabilities. And you still need to use these apps as well. So it's not just the very small part of the pie that we're trying to cater to here, it's you. So here's a real basic code example. If you use a button like this, it's accessible, just inherently accessible. If you use a link by using an anchor tag, it too is accessible. If, however, you use a div with an onClick, it is not accessible. someone cannot use it without adding extra functionality. Oftentimes that means more JavaScript, more CSS, and additional tags just to make it work. So my question at this point is, would you rather make a button and a link, or would you rather go through a lot of extra work to make a div accessible? In the end, HTML is pretty inherently accessible. Why don't we just use it for the way that it's meant to be used? And then we build upon that. The first rule of ARIA Club, don't use ARIA. You really don't need to for the most part. ARIA is for those special cases when you're not using inherently accessible code. So there's a whole lot of links here. You will end up having access to that later. But I did want to show you the very first link on this page. So when you're looking at this, they did a very lovely job of making sure that you could have a checklist of items that you can do in your website to make incremental accessibility changes. Simple things that you could just check off this list, like I converted divs to buttons, or you added roles to complementary things. You added footers, form roles, and this list goes on and on and on. And it gets more and more complex as you go. This is a really simple way to start somewhere. Even if you don't end up at the perfect accessible range at the end, or to begin with, you're at least starting somewhere. You're at least making incremental changes. And sometimes when you've got an experienced, long-running code base, all you can fit in are some incremental changes here and there. But if you keep making those incremental changes and you continue moving forward with writing good accessible code, it won't take all that long before your code base is in fact fully accessible. So back to what makes a component reusable. Oftentimes we think that we need to have isolated components. However, we also need to make sure that they're not too isolated. And for this, I have a story. My company used to have one very mega conglomerate website. Everything was built into one CMS. We decided that it was time to break out our different classified verticals into their own websites. So now we have classifieds and cars and homes and jobs and services. This is a very lovely image of our GitHub repo at about the end of 2015. Each dot is a file, and that little tiny yellow hexagon, that's our API. So we wanted to just have a little consistency across these verticals. We wanted to make sure that our components were reusable with each other. We weren't even looking at making something OSS yet, just so that we could share the classifieds components with the cars components, because tabs look the same and buttons basically look the same. However, we were really afraid of another framework like React or Angular or Elm or any of these things that said, we're a framework, and this is why. This is framework. That's a lot of framework just for a little tiny API. We had a large amount of data that we were pushing through a tiny API, and we were using a huge amount of code just to show it to you. So adding another Zen framework or jQuery UI development bundle, or even building upon our custom CMS, was really just more code that we did not want to maintain. So we decided that CSS and JavaScript and PHP, those were going to be fine for us. So we put together a team, a bunch of front-end devs, a couple of designers, and we called ourselves the Manhattan Hardcore Project. because we are making atomic components, people. Clearly, we thought highly of ourselves, and it took about 5.6 seconds to figure out that we were going to learn lessons through pain. Failure was absolutely going to be our path to success. We started making our components, and one of the very first things we did was we created a living style guide. This living style guide is something that's still in use today. It, by definition of living, means that as we make changes to our GitHub repos, it dynamically updates itself. It's quite lovely, and we still reference it, even though it's been a few years. And it's kind of updated itself as we went along. And when we made this, we really thought, this is going to be great. And then we have the bad. So we decided we were going to make a modal. And this modal required all of that code. So every single web page that used a modal had to have the exact same file structure for a modal. We immediately changed that structure for other components. There was also no accessibility testing. It was horrible. All of those modals ended up reading before you even got to the rest of the content. So you had to wade through every single modal before you could even get to the top of the page. We also used an SVG icon font. To this day, this SVG icon font requires that we downgrade Node to version 0.12. And because of the fact that we built it into our header and a whole bunch of other components, we have to use naming conventions when we add new icons that come alphabetically after the word triangle, which leads to words like 0 left, weighted heart, and Z thumbs up. Conveniently, right after this talk is Christy Giles, and she's going to be going over more items that are SVG icon sprites instead of icon fonts. We have since switched to this and love it. And for the ugly, we used ideal data. We had our components completely isolated into their own pristine code bases. There was no code other than what we hard-coded in, and they ran on their own page. There was nothing else on it. So when we used words like Jon Snow for our naming conventions, QA would come in and put this monstrosity, and clearly it would break. And we did that for everything. So as soon as our team started trying to incorporate the components that we had, we ended up having some difficulties because our data was ideal and theirs was normal, messy, long names, short names, different widths, and ours was exact. So we took our wins and we took our losses and we got some training. This was fantastic, by the way. I'm really glad for this experience. And we decided to say just the header. We're going to use what Ryan Florence recommended and just build something, just one little thing, and then you build another little thing and another little thing, and it comes together. And so we are building just the header. Turns out the header includes drop-down menus, responsive hamburger menus, modals, dynamic login detection, dynamic menu resizing on scroll, weather modals with geolocation, icon fonts, and a search bar. It was huge, required jQuery, and came with a whole host of Webpack, Bower, Gulp, build process complexity that none of us knew anything about. We decided that instead of making an isolated header package, we would allow and require everyone who's using our header to bring in each of these dependencies independently so they could use them on their own pages. That meant that people that were not using React and were not using any modals, that were not using any menus, that weren't using anything other than the header, had to carry the weight and the burden of bringing in every component. What we learned from this is that we didn't isolate enough. One important tag led to another, and we dug ourselves out of the pit of despair the usual way. So when you want to make isolated components, make sure that they are, in fact, an individually dist package. You can actually serve it to someone in one package. If you're requiring that they bring in each and every single component on their own, you're going to end up with a lot of code that no one's ever going to use, and it slows down the page, and it's very heavy. Don't make it so isolated, however, that your users can't use it, or they have to spend so much time refactoring it just to make it work with our understandably messy code bases. None of us have a pristine code base. And every single one of our component users are going to need to interact with our code. When interacting, we also need to make sure, for obvious reasons, that they're brandable. And by this, I mean that you are able to make your component match your company brand. We not only are trying to serve it through the classifieds verticals, we also have sister companies like Utah.com that could potentially use our components as well, but their styles are completely different than ours. So if you are looking for a CSS and JS library comparison, I'm not going to do that today. However, there's a newly released CSS and JS playground that's really rather nice. What it has done is it's created this web page in about 6 different CSS and JS libraries. You just have to choose the drop-down and choose the one that you want. And it does, in fact, show you how to style it in each of those libraries. The link is also in the slides. You can go to that later. But it's a really great resource for that comparison. I posed a question to Twitter, and I asked, what does reusable mean for you, and what is it you want to learn? And this is one question that really stuck with me. How do we make a usable component without knowing which approach to styling and theming the consumer will use? And it kind of took me back. It kind of surprised me, because our components are supposed to be isolated, right? And then I remembered, we have a lot of CSS and JS libraries, and a lot of us are still using Sass and less with, CSS components. So how do we figure that out? And the truth of the matter is it doesn't matter. The styles inside and outside are mutually exclusive. So let's look at this. We have styled props, we have composables, we have theming, but they're all just ways of taking a prop and then passing it through your component to restyle it. So here's composables with Glamorous. We may be using Glamorous code within, but all we're looking for is to be passed a few new styles, and then we compose them in order to make our new component. A user can choose to either do this outside or pass us the prop, and we can do it on the inside. Here's theming with Aphrodite and Glamour. The code, you'll notice, is almost identical. This is using a common component called theme provider and get theme. You do not have to be using a CSS component to use theme provider. However, almost all of them use it, which means that they all have a common standard. You can accept that theme prop and then pass it through. The most important part of all of these, however, is to make sure that you document. As the previous a couple of talks have said, or I've heard a few times today, is that you are not the same person today or tomorrow as you were today. And 6 months from now, you might as well have never written the code. You will not remember it. So if you write documentation for no one else but yourself, you will appreciate it. The side benefit is anyone else using your component is also going to appreciate it. You may accept a theme prop, you may accept a CSS prop, you may accept some composable props, but if you don't know what's accepted within the code itself, outsiders are going to assume it's really bad code because they don't know how to use it. Documentation is really important. Now, you could do documentation by marking out every single line of code that they can use. You could also just provide an example file that shows them what those values are. Or you could put aside styling all together and do something very similar to Ryan Florence's reusable or compound components that allows the user themselves to style it however they like and to just call the component itself. Very similar to a way that we use a select element. All we do is we provide it the value and we provide it the name that we want to display in the options, and the select component itself is what determines and maintains the state of what's selected and what's supposed to be shown. If you're interested in those, absolutely check out the video for Ryan Florence's compound components. He gave that talk at the Phoenix.js meetup. So in short, oh my goodness, accept a prop for styles and composition and theming. Don't forget to document. And remember that above all else, be kind, for everyone you know is fighting JavaScript. Or CSS and JS. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
So, you had the living style guide.
Yes.
Could you do something like that with Storybook, or would you be recommendable as well?
You absolutely can do something. The question was, living style guides, can you do that with Storybook? And you can do that with Storybook. We decided to do something slightly different in that we have a release on a GitHub page that whenever we submit any of the changes, it pulls the data from the different components itself. Do we have any other questions? Yes?
Would you be willing to show off that style guide?
Style guide. I would be. Let me make this a little bit easier for me. Maybe. Or not. But I'd be more than happy to do so after. Do we have any other questions? Yes?
Were there any arguments about the style guide? What should go in it, or how strictly it should be adhered to?
For the most part, what we did for our style guide was put down as many of the components we could, but a lot of it also includes the CSS requirements that we have. So that is a rather small photo, and I apologize for that. What we do have here is we have our overview, but we also show our colors and our layout, some typography. So it goes through our icon fonts and our fonts themselves. There's the icons, how we handle rating stars, links, buttons, variables, fonts, formats, panels, headers, as many things as we could think of to toss in here. We have since then increased the number of components. So it has grown as well. What we ended up doing to keep our components viewable is we created a separate repo and put all of our individual components there, and that's how we could pull our style guide through that, was by pulling all of the components in that repo. Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned that you decided you didn't want to choose like a framework or library just for that flow.
Yeah.
How do you distribute components if there is like an artifact that you're distributing? And if you don't distribute an artifact for your components, how do you manage updating all of the different consumers of your style guide or your components?
Good question. Things do get lost. All of our code bases are messy. So sometimes that comes down to communication, talking to your teams and making sure that they haven't done it before. And if they have, nod, smile, and help them put it within the living style guide. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to ask a follow-up. So your style guide is like a true style guide where you'd be looking at that and then like re-implementing it into a different site. It's not like you can't like npm install something from your style guide and consume it.
Nope, each individual component is its own repo.
Oh, okay.
So we end up being able to npm install each of the individual components themselves. However, the style guide is a composite of those.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Time for one more question.
Yes.
What was the firework chart that you used for your commits?
That was called Grouse.
Yeah, what's it called?
It's called Grouse, Grouce. What the Grouse does is you give it either a repo or a text file that has an assortment of repos, and it gives you a timeline of the growth of your component or the entire repo. So to get from the very beginning of our repo in 2012 to get to today takes almost 45 minutes at the fastest I can make it go to show all of the progress over time. And it does show every commit, and it also has little tiny people that you can see running around and changing files. It's really fun. And if that's it, I will be available for any other questions or comments that you have. Thank you again for coming.